Welcome to Kingdom of the Logos, a Christian program of critical thinking and adventure. I am J. Daniel Proctor.
I'm Amanda Sparrow.
And I'm Anthony Allegria.
And we are here today in Chord Purgatory. That is the name of our studio. It has been called that by people who come to visit us. They go in there and they say, wow, that is a lot of chords. You must all be being punished for all of your crimes and sins for being locked up in a cord-ridden closet for so long.
Anyways, we have cleaned it up a lot since it's true purgatory days, though.
It is not the purgatory that it used to be. We've moved up a layer, actually.
Yep.
We're getting close to the top. If you support us and share our content, we'll hopefully get out of purgatory. Terrible. I don't take that too seriously. That was a joke. Anyways, so for our conversation today, we got a question that I think is worth asking because it is a very question about Christian orthodoxy. Somebody came to me and they said, preacher, which is what they call people out here in the country, the preacher, if someone dies in sin, what happens to them? It's a great question. It's one that I think is a very, very healthy question for us to talk about. So I just want to present it with you all. We're not going to rat out the person who asked it. Snitches get stitches. We're not going to be a snitch. But conversational-wise, it is a great question for us all to answer and think about. And I know we talk about current events a lot, but let's talk about some Orthodox theology. So, Amanda, we'll start with you.
All right, so when I first heard this question, I think there's lots of layers to what this person is asking. They're asking about what is sin. They're asking about what is salvation or the potential for repentance, and then ultimately what happens after we die. And oftentimes, if you're even barely familiar with Christianity, you've probably heard of this concept of heaven and hell. And so the kind of knee-jerk reaction would be, okay, if they die in sin, they go to hell. And then in recent times, a lot of popular Christianity has been struggling with this issue. Is there even a hell? Well, what happens? Can a merciful and just God send people to hell? And so there's a lot to unpack, kind of even in that short little question that's asking. And I think anytime I come to the concept of hell and what happens after we die, in my education, one of my professors, I think, said one of the most profound things that have really impacted how I enter this conversation is if we truly understand our God that has given us free will, then there has to be a hell. There has to be a place for people to exist outside of the life of God. God never forces God's self on others, even in the afterlife, even after we have died. So as we come to this conversation, it really is important for us to realize God does not want us to be separated from God's self, from God's love, from life and life everlasting. That is not God's intent. However, again, we are creatures of free will. We get to choose. If we are mature adults that have grown into that ability to weigh choices, we understand the concept of prevenient grace, that is that children or those who do not mentally have the capacity to choose, they are covered by grace. But for those of us who can make that choice, we are then responsible for the decisions we make.
We're going back just a second, Amanda, because you mentioned earlier that God desires for us to be with him. And one of the very popular definitions for hell actually is not that hell is hellfire, brimstone, this place of eternal suffering where somehow your body doesn't go into shock, but you just perpetually suffer in a tangible way. But this idea that hell itself is just the absence of God, or being outside of the proximity of God, being separated from God. And I think that's actually interesting. What are your thoughts on that?
I think I would agree with that in a sense of also when we, even on kind of the flip side, when we depict heaven and we say the streets are lined with gold, whether or not gold is literally paving the sidewalk is, it's minuscule compared to the fact it's describing this imagery of great comfort and fulfillment and, life is abundant here, that even the dirt we walk on is precious. And so then the flip side then that is when we describe hell as fire and brimstone and pitchforks and flames and torture, whether that's literally what's happening, probably not. There are more imageries to describe this that, again, God has created space for us to choose to be outside of that loving relationship. And anything outside of perfect, holy, compassionate, all-consuming love that is God is going to be miserable. Anything outside of God is going to be miserable. And so we have this, again, this imagery, and we also, Scripture also talks about hell was made for demons and angels who had fallen and all those different things, and that goes maybe into a different little side tangent. But the purpose again for this place is not that God thought one day, I think the sinners, the dirty, rotten sinners, need a place to be tortured, as much as it is, if you choose to exist outside of God's love, then there is a place for you.
Yeah, then you're outside of God's love.
You're outside, and that's not a good place to be. Yeah. And so then logically in our brains, we're like, well, then why would anyone choose that? But to live into God's holiness, to be a part of that relationship, is something that calls responsibility on ourselves. Yeah. And also for us to allow God to transform us. So it becomes, it's not an easy choice necessarily. If we fully comprehend what the call of the gospel, the call of the kingdom is, it's not simple and easy, but at the same time, it is definitely more life-giving than the alternative. And so I think, again, thinking of hell in that concept can be a much more appropriate way.
Yeah.
Anthony? Earlier, you guys were saying that it could, correct me if I'm wrong, but that hell is kind of a product of free will. And is that kind of in line with what you were saying earlier, that if you do want to be outside of God's presence?
Yeah, I wouldn't say product
of
either.
Free will. Yeah. But it is maybe a consequence might not be the right word.
I would say that it's consistent with a reality that has free will in it. If we're going to say that there's free will, then that is consistent with the same reality that people can choose. And again, if you're going to be making choices, the only choices that are real choices are choices of things which are fundamentally different. Like going to the fridge and saying, I'm choosing between Coke and Pepsi. There may be a lot of people who say these are fundamentally different, but they're kind of the same thing.
Well, more like, if there really isn't a choice, it'd be like going to the fridge and saying, I'm choosing a Coke, but all that's in the fridge is Coke. Right?
Yeah.
So that's not really a choice that's happening versus, but no, again, it's not that we then in of ourselves created hell as a product of our free will. That's not exactly what we're trying to say. But
no, I didn't mean it that way.
That's I think that product language can be difficult.
I think God, in many ways, God gave us free will. Mm-hmm. God created free will.
Yeah.
So in creating
we're modeled
free
after
will,
God, and God, the very essence is centered around the concept of will. So for sure.
Yeah. So in creating free will, hell was also created. Because if you can choose to be away from God in life,
well, I think
it seems to be meritable to argue that you can choose to be away from God in death.
A good understanding of hell. And again, I want us to move our conversation to sin. But while we're on hell, this final thought. Well, first off, I think at best we can all agree the language of both heaven and hell in Scripture is ambiguous at best. The imagery is ambiguous at best, and even things like angel, going back to the concept of angelon, the messenger, and even going back to some of the really old descriptions we have of sort of non-human beings we get in the Old Testament, it's ambiguous at best. But one of the things that is quite clearly laid out in good Orthodox theology is this imagery of light and darkness, which is a bit more abstract, but also very interesting because God being portrayed as light, very, very often we see this. He's not only portrayed as light, but one of the things used to help us understand God is that God is light. We see a lot of this in the epistles of John. We've been talking about John, and we're doing a study in the epistles of John here at Jolton. John opens up with this talk again about the Logos, but also this idea of God being light. Well, the interesting thing about light is you don't actually have darkness. Darkness isn't really a thing. It's not the same as light. You don't turn on darkness. Darkness is that which happens in the absence of light. And I think a good understanding for not just hell, but things which are dark, things of that matter, hellacious matter, are things which, in a creation consistent with free will, there are people who do not choose to do positive things. There are people who do not choose to go into the light, so they go to the things which are nihilistic. They're sort of non-existent in the fact that they are not things which are quantifiably existing. And especially from the standpoint of theology, I think a good understanding of hell is not so much that God created this place of suffering, but God created a place of blessing, but people have the choice whether or not to enter in that. And so it's there as an absence of the other instead of being an intentionally created thing.
Yeah, I suppose the language of created hell is bad. But, if you turn on a light, one spot's going to be dark.
Kind of.
I guess they were both dark.
It's not so much
before.
that it makes it dark, it's just the light isn't going there.
Yeah.
Moving on to the question of sin, because this is another question that really comes up from that. What is sin, and how does that relate to salvation? We are Nazarene clergy. From the standpoint of being that in the Church of Nazarene, we talk a lot about sanctification. In the past, we've talked a lot about baptism and sanctification, but also, or baptism and salvation. But now for salvation and sanctification. I know a lot of big S words. Salvation and sanctification are not the same thing. You know, there's so many people who come at you for saying that. In the Church of Nazarene, we treat it as a second work of grace. And yes, I know everybody, well, there's instant sanctification different from perfect or Christian perfection and entire sanctification. Setting all the legalistic, crazy language aside, getting down to earth for a moment, we can say without a shadow of a doubt, there are people who accept the testimony of Christ, but they have not yet been transformed into an entirely holy being. I think, can we all agree on that? I mean, even when we look in the Gospels, we see people, the disciples, who they accept Christ's testimony, but they don't really understand exactly what this means. And one of the angles that this question struck me is if maybe somebody does believe, but they still have sin in their life to some capacity, well, what happens to them? And my thoughts immediately were God has grace on people. First and foremost, God is a God of grace. God is a God of love. If somebody has accepted Christ's testimony, I don't really think you have anything to worry about, even if they haven't moved towards sanctification. But I'll just pitch that over to you, the saved but not sanctified side of things.
No, I think you've pretty well explained it. It is that, sorry, I'm trying to get my words together. So Christ died, and there's this one work done through the cross, and we do journey with God. And so there's kind of this, like you said, there's all these phrases in the Church of Nazarene and other denominations that we have for this salvation, also known as initial sanctification. Mm-hmm. But really it is this coming to where we recognize our need that in of our own power, or even within worldly powers, whether it be the government or systems and structures or culture, we cannot live life and live life abundantly. We cannot live it holistically. And we come to the realization that we are in need of Christ to do that. And we realize that further on in that journey, we come to a second point, so a second definite work, where we realize that we have to surrender our whole self to God to be transformed, not just our past sins, but our thoughts, our deeds, the way we order our life. And entirely sanctified just means entirely set apart. It's very kind of simple definition for it. H.A. Dunning would say sanctification is Christ-likeness, so being that transformation. But that transformation happens daily. And we are more and more and more transformed. So to your point, trying to bring it back to your question, is that every day we are being perfected, but we can be more perfected each day. And so in that moment, like where a completely crazy example that's been used a lot, especially kind of camp meeting preachers, is what happens if you get struck by a bus tomorrow? Someone, say someone does accept God, but there still is things in their life that they're battling with, that they're struggling with, and they die. What happens is, again, God's grace says you are allowing yourself to be transformed. Maybe not all the pieces are perfectly put together yet, but you have decided of your free will to participate in the life and a relationship with God. And so that's kind of the requirement, and that's really not good language either, but that's what it means to be saved, is to live in right relationship with God. And maybe not everything is exactly right, but you're moving to that point. You're not being lazy, you're not being stagnant, you're not trying to resist that transformation, but you're still being transformed, you're still on that journey. And so in that instance, because you're in relationship with God, you're going to live an eternity in relationship with God.
I think that's great. Well, we'll wrap up this conversation there. Before we move on to another conversation, any final thoughts? Amanda? Anthony?
I might ask, how, just for to clarify stuff, how might you guys determine better when someone isn't in the circumference of salvation, I guess, but for instance, they claim to believe.
Anthony had to have that extra jab in there. Like, how much trouble can we get in today? Let me throw something in there that makes us all unemployable for the future.
This is the danger zone. But
Oh, I'm ready for the danger zone. Bring it.
All right, so they claim to believe, but then obviously they don't reflect any of that.
Well, first off, we didn't come to the internet because we weren't planning on people coming to come after your throat. We knew what happened when you get on the internet. To answer your question, I think. And again, I don't think that if test or standard is necessarily the best language, but the question is, when you've been presented the gospel of Jesus Christ, how did you react to that? Did you reject it? Are you somebody who lives a life consistent with saying that bad is good and good is bad? And I don't just mean good in the abstract, secular way. I mean good as being the things which come out of the nature of God. Do you say the nature of God is good? Do you say that the nihilistic void outside of the nature of God is evil? Or do you say that's good? Where do you stack up against holiness? That's the question. How did you react? If you reacted positively, and when I say positively, I mean you accepted, you affirmed the gospel, and you said, I am accepting this in my life, then yes, you are within the confines of God's salvation. And that's the place where I draw the line. Mm-hmm. I realize that sometimes people do not pull or pursue sanctification. They do not pull holiness down to their life, which I guess maybe I should say elevate up to, not pull down. But I think God still has grace for them, and I know it's the sanctified preacher, or the sanctification-oriented preacher who talks a lot about sanctified and things of that nature. I want people to move that direction, but at the same time I realize that not everybody does it. It's not my job to judge them, so God has grace on people, mm-hmm. and when people have received the gospel message, God certainly steps in there with grace.
Yeah, and I think, again, talking about a couple episodes ago, we talked about what if we had to do Charles Manson's funeral, or anyone of that kind of nature, someone of great evil. And though we are called to be people who judge, we judge using God's rubric, not our own. Yep. But ultimately, we leave the ultimate decision to God. Yep. And we, as ministers of the gospel, are called to call people to holiness. And so when we see things in people's lives to say, hey, this is interrupting your relationship with God, interrupting your relationship with other people, with nature, within yourself, this is harmful. And God has called you to live a life and live it abundantly. I know I've said that 100 times, but that's the gospel, right? Christ has come that you may have life and have it to its fullest. And so when we see those things, we direct people. And again, as Pastor Dylan said, then what is their response? Are they continually fighting that call to live a transformed life? Or are they living into it, but they're still struggling, but they're still living into it, but they're still struggling? And we have to give people that opportunity. And again, we do our part. We live a holy life. We call other people. We encourage other people to live holy lives. Ultimately, it is their decision, and God is judge. So we give that to him. But that doesn't mean we get to slack off either as people of the kingdom. So,
very good. We'll leave it there.